Substance of what we're supposed to speak about, of course, is, I guess, the third of what I argue are four different strategies that emerged that proved successful in maintaining the identity and allegiance of Jews to the core of traditionalism, which is the belief in the total belief in God and belief in the laws, nominalism and fundamentalism, as they call it. And this has to do with what comes to be known as the German model. And just to make everyone recall, Germany in the 19th century over here doesn't quite exist. It's after this is a map from the year 1815, and as you can see what I'm pointing to, Germany was a collection of states, which became a united empire only in 1870, at the time of Bismarck. And so some states, like I'm pointing to right now, like Prussia, were quite large. Some were states that were the size of the city, like Frankfurt or Hamburg, and everything in between. Now, we talked earlier about the fact that the Jews over there underwent a period of great stress in terms of traditionalism because of the events that have been taking place in Europe so long, such as French Revolution and the liberalism and the Enlightenment, Jewish Enlightenment and the non-Jewish Enlightenment, the new trend of ideas, the idealistic philosophy, the historicism, the urbanization, all those, the new paradigms of education, all those issues that I threw out in earlier classes. The question becomes, so how did anybody want to stay religious at all? Here we become associated with small groups that grow and influence and reach a certain popularity among a small but significant minority of the German Jewry, and the first of these is dated to over here in Hamburg in the early 1800s, where by the time you get to the year of this map, 1815, you have to simply understand that in most of Germany by then, most of the German states, not here but all in the north, the questions of changes in traditionalism, how much of the old you want to keep up, were not even questions anymore. People voted with their feet. People simply stopped dressing in the old ways. Even religious people, even Shomer Shabbos. The women stopped dressing in the old ways. People just started to go to whatever schools they wanted to go. And no one was asking shilos anymore. And this was a almost universal trend. And when you get to the significant communities in northern Germany, people are just doing what they want to do. I didn't say that they became reform. I did not say that they gave up their beliefs in fundamentalism and in nomianism and all that. But at the level of personal practice, they didn't ask anybody whether it's okay to have a TV. They just did it. They didn't ask anybody if it's okay to have a movie. They just did it. They didn't ask anybody if it's okay to wear a top hat versus a shtreimel or something like that. They just did it. And in this context, that shows you that setting ideology aside, Jews in Germany simply made the decision that they wanted to acculturate to some degree or another. And the fact that their parents or certainly their grandparents would have been very uncomfortable with the position they were taking no longer was relevant. It didn't matter. And the result is that when you look at Jews in the area I'm talking about, they're up for grabs. Which way is it going to go? The trends that led to people changing in education and language and dress and perhaps what they consider religiously appropriate, as I've said before, these trends were so powerful that, if anything, those who were still religious had to find their grounding, their feet, in a great wave that was pushing them in a way that seemed very far away from not only traditionalism, but any kind of old Yiddishkeit at all. And in Hamburg, as I said before, these trends crystallized into having the first Reformed temple in 1819, which means that there were a number of members of the community, young members, professionals actually, who wanted to go all the way and did something that no one ever really had done before, and that is to take the ideas that they have away from traditionalism and actually put them in some kind of organizational form, a synagogue or a temple as they call it, and to actually create a new Jewish theology and a new siddur and a new set of practices. And not to do what had been done until then, which was just not keep Shabbos, just not keep kosher, just act. in an antinomian fashion, but not try to create an ideology of it. Now they crystallized and developed into a form in which they wanted, and they did, say, why should we pretend? Why should we say prayers we don't believe in? Why should we do practices that make no sense to us? If you religious people really mean what you say you want to go move to Palestine, go to Israel. Don't be a hypocrite. Makes sense. If you really believe in all these old things, so do it. But you yourselves are changing radically and significantly in many areas of life. And so the only difference between us and you is we're willing to go all the way and admit it. And you, as someone once said, hypocrisy is the tribute the vice pays the virtue. That you simply want to behave hypocritically. Used to call it in Germany Schinken Orthodoxy, which means the hand-eating Orthodox. Whereas we're so familiar with in America, people who belong to Orthodox synagogues or things of that nature, but they don't not live a, as we would call Shomer Shabbos lifestyle at all. And these were the trends that were developing there. And when the temple is created in 1819, it caused a storm of opposition from these old-fashioned big rabbis elsewhere. The Chassam Sofer, Rabbi Akiva Eger, the Nesivos of Yaakov Lissa in Poland. These are people who lived far away. What they said actually was of no relevance whatsoever to the Jews who lived in Germany. First of all, it was all written in Hebrew. Second of all, the arguments they made were of a different cultural background than the German Jews to which they were addressed. And the result is that it didn't bother the Reform Jews at all. And so when the more traditionalist members of the community got together and figured, what are we going to do about this? So in a very interesting way, they said, we have to introduce some radical changes into the way we've been doing business until now, starting with, we better get a new model of a rabbi in here, which means we need someone who's going to be religious but not old-fashioned. He's going to be traditionalist but not traditionalist. What does that mean? Well, he's going to look different. He's going to have a different education. He's going to talk different. He's probably going to have a much different set of sensibilities. He's going to be much more sensitive to issues that would concern a man or a woman in the 19th century. But he's going to be from. So how do you define the word from? How do you define, which means pious in German? How do you define that? So obviously they're going to say, well, they didn't know exactly, but they certainly knew he's going to have to be a shomer mitzvahs. Means they have a shomer Shabbos, let's put it that way. He has to be kosher. And they also knew that he's going to have to, even though they're not philosophers and theologians, he's absolutely in the Torah, whatever that is. God, don't ask me what it is, because the people I'm talking about themselves were by and large, except for a few intellectuals, Balabatim. They knew Judaism when they see it and they smell it. The old smell test. I know it looks like a dog and it walks like a dog. If you ask them, do you hold like the Rambam's opinion of providence, or the Ravid's opinion, or the Rambam? These words don't mean anything to them. And so what they did most unusually was they started looking around the universities for the next rabbi. Whereas until then, if you were in Germany, until early 1800s, if you wanted a rabbi, very easily, you went to Poland. And you asked, who's the biggest Talmud Chacham around? And that money can buy, so to speak. And that's what it was. And they imported them in, and all the great rabbis of the 18th century were Polish rabbis that moved to Germany. The Noda Yehuda was in Prague, originally from Poland. The Pnei Yeshua was in Frankfurt. Rionos and Eibschutz, obviously, was in many cities. Family originally from Poland. The Shagasaria was in Metz. He was in France. Shagasaria Yeshua is from there. And one name after another simply was that they would move to the West because that's where the communities were, which could pay a larger salary and perhaps support a larger yeshiva or something like that. But they brought in rabbis who talked different than them and had different ideas. But fundamentally, in the old days, it was all the same. Everybody, if you speak one kind of Yiddish versus speak another kind of Yiddish, doesn't matter so much. And the kind of speech the person would give, which would be very Torah-oriented and pilpholistic, was the same kind of speech that would find resonance in Eastern Europe and would find resonance in Western Europe. Not anymore, not when you get to 1820. And so the board of directors of the Hamburg community started asking around in the University of Berlin and these other places, non-Jewish professors. And he said, who do you know that you would recommend would make a good Orthodox rabbi for us? Someone who has a high moral character. It's quite strange. A high moral character. We're sure the Jewish knowledge will be sufficient, whatever it is. and type of person who would make a good impression on you as a Gentile. In other words, as I tried to explain a couple weeks ago, it was a month already, even the traditionalists were by and large subscribing to the ideals of Reform A, not Reform B, in one degree or another. They wanted change, they wanted modernization. And they did do exactly this, and they finally got together with the couple of professors at the University of Bonn and in West Germany, and they said, well, we have a young guy here who will be just good for you as a rabbi. His name is Bernays, Yitzchak Bernays. And I don't know what he knows on the Jewish end, although he seems pretty knowledgeable over there, but he certainly makes a good impression to us as a human being. And his German is good, and he hasn't finished his doctorate yet, but that doesn't really matter, because you don't need people to give philosophical disquisitions, to the Balabatim, who really were the opposite of intellectuals. But he's the type of guy, and they hired him. And he came there, and he really had new ideas. He was from a yeshiva originally, but the fact that he went to university means he's different. And he came to Hamburg with the mission of trying to establish a new kind of Yiddishkeit, which means, of course, the old system in terms of loyalty to Torah and mitzvahs, the old in terms of fundamentals of Emunah, God, the Torah, everything that goes along with that. But other than that, he's open to new ideas. No more yeshivas. We need something which he calls a day school, which is like a radical, crazy idea. And you need schools perhaps even for, God help us, women. And you need a school. Well, this was not done. It was not done. And you need a school that will provide what we would call here a secular education, together with a Judaic education, which again was a radical change. And to equate the Torah with anything else was heresy. And he said, I'm not equating it, but in terms of the curriculum, we're going to give more time to the secular subjects than to the Judaic ones. I'll say it again, we give more time to the secular subjects than the Judaic ones, because we have to turn out people who be balabatim to make a living. They have to be able to, go after high school to some kind of a situation where they can make a living, but not lose their Judaism, not lose their Yiddishkeit. We're not looking over here to produce the next generation of Talmudic giants, but after all, we got plenty of them over here. Right? There were. Well, we need balabatim who will grow up and choose on their own, as a result of their experience in education when they're young, freely and voluntarily, to want to remain religious, even if they'll become, as he envisioned, businessmen. Very, very few people actually went to university, which means graduate school at that time. It would be counted on your fingers. He wasn't. That's not this element. That doesn't happen among what you call religious Jews until much later in the 19th century. Talking about people who have, in the German system, a high school education, which will enable them to graduate after the 10th or 11th grade, because that's what the schools went up to, and go out and join a business. So here you have a young fellow who's 15 years old, something along those lines, and he's learned in high school what you call business math and accounting, basic accounting procedures, bookkeeping, whatever, those sorts of subjects. Not philosophy and not history, except at the most basic level. Things you'll need to get a job with a business. And you'll start out when you're 15 or 16 years old at a low level, obviously, but by the time you're 20, 25, you will have risen. Maybe if you have enough pluck and energy, you make your own company. If not, you'll find a decent position within an existing company, and you'll be able to get married and support a family. In other words, the bourgeois ideal of the 19th century, which still remains so powerful in the Frum community today. Now, this rabbi's name was Rabbi Yitzchak Bernays, and he founded this school, which was quite new. And to him, this is going to be the way to fight against the Reform Jews. And he was very bitterly opposed to the Reform Jews, and he put him in Cherem, and they had a lot of words back and forth with each other. But of course, he could never hope with his approach to persuade the Reform Jews to become Orthodox. It's not a matter of trying to make Baalei Teshuvah. He was just trying to stem the tide. He's trying to hold those who haven't defected yet within the fold. And he was fairly successful at this. I say fairly successful in the sense that from his time on down to Hitler, the school he founded, the Talmud Torah school, was a well-known day school with boys and girls, with different parts of the building. And, many hundreds of students went there down the ages. never was particularly strong on the Judaic subjects, broadly successful in persuading their students to, after they graduate high school and they enter businesses, to stay members of the Orthodox community with one level more or less of mitzvah observance. And that, as I said before, is pretty much the way the greater Hamburg community persisted down to its demise. So he was on to something. Now, he himself taught the highest shiur, which would be something like the 10th grade, and he was a charismatic teacher in terms of interacting with the boys, the type of person you'd say today was a popular Rebbe, even though he was the Rav of the town, so he was more than just a high school Rebbe, but nevertheless, he was that type. He used to teach extra classes in Kuzari, which is very significant, because the Kuzari, of course, is all about Hashkafa, and the Kuzari is anti-Maimonidean. This is not the Rambam. It's not what you think. One would think that if you're talking about modernity and a new way of approaching Judaism, one will fall back to the good old Maimonidean rationalism and the Torah Mad, as we call it, of the Middle Ages, and that's actually a position that he was opposed to, as we'll see in a few minutes. On the contrary, he was into making the argument that Judaism, it's a very right-wing argument, Judaism is a unique phenomenon, can't be comprehended by philosophy or anything like that. It has to be understood internally, and that what the quote-unquote Goyish world has to offer us is not anything we're interested in. Very interesting set of principles, and he made an impact on many of his students. I think the first class or the second class included the most famous of his students, which of course is Rabbi Hirsch. Yeah? And because that's what he did. Rabbi Hirsch went to the 9th grade, I guess, or 10th grade, however much it was at that time. Never went past the 10th grade, I think. And he came from, a young boy, he came from a family exactly along lines that I just described. They were Shomer Shabbos, they were religious Jews. We have pictures of them, completely modern in dress, completely modern in the sense that they spoke German in the home as well as Yiddish, both. We have police reports. Later on, when Rabbi Hirsch was applying for a job as a rabbi in one of the states, they sent us, FBI report on his family, as you do in this country when you get a government position often. And they said, well, his family's modern Orthodox. They're religious. They're enlightened religious. It's modern, they're enlightened, but they are religious. They're not Reformed Jews. And his parents were staunch supporters of this Rabbi Bernays that I just described. They're very anti-Reform, but as I say before, they didn't have payas. And, his mother dressed, she had a sheitel, but sheitel is already a modern statement. Right? Once upon a time, no decent, frum woman would get caught with a sheitel. This was a great halachic controversy in earlier centuries. But by the 19th century, it's in. And dressed in European fashion. And as I say before, he learned to play the violin. They like to go to, concerts and things of this nature. No question that if you tell them that acculturation is usser, which the Hasidim would say, for example, and the Chassam Sofer, if you asked him, would say, they would say, no, there's nothing wrong with acculturation, provided it doesn't lead to a failure to keep mitzvahs on the one hand, and to fundamental issues of emunah, which they call fundamentalism on the other hand. And this is who he was. And he goes to this school, and when he graduates over here, he goes to a very good college, a gymnasium as they call it in Germany, which we equivalent, without going into too many details of you end up with a BA, the equivalent of that. And a very hard one, a Christian gymnasium, because there weren't any secular ones, a Protestant one, where in the good old style, you had to write at least 3 essays a week. So it's sink or swim. So they give you an education. As they say, they stretch your mind. And when he's, I think, 20 years old, he graduates from there. And then, just as nowadays, it's the fashion for boys and girls to go off for a year of learning in Israel. So he, when it wasn't a fashion, took off a year after finishing college to go study in yeshiva for a year, which he does in South Germany, a small yeshiva with 20, 30 boys down here in Mannheim, where he had a close, which is a small yeshiva, run by Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger, who later became a very famous rabbi in Germany, leading halachic authority in Hamburg when he moved to in later years. And so Hirsch was, I'm describing to you someone who does not fit at all the profile of the Gadol. They all have a certain profile. And that's because they all come from a very similar background. They come from usually an elite family, certainly showed a very intellectual precocity at a very young age. After a while, they're soon recognized as stars in the old system. At bar mitzvah, they can give a whole very learned discourse and probably get married at 13 or 14 to somebody from a similar background, either in terms of rabbinical class or wealth or something along those lines. And it's not a cookie cutter exactly. If you study each and every person's biography, they're unique individuals. But broadly speaking, there is most definitely a cookie cutter profile, without question. And here's somebody that went to something less than TA, fewer hours than TA, and fewer hours, I say, and went a grand total of 1 year in his life to yeshiva. There are many girls that won't go out today with a guy just went 1 year in his life to yeshiva. And after that, he went to university, graduate school, to get a doctorate in philosophy. Now he wanted to become a rabbi from a young age. So this is even more unusual. Somebody who wants to become a rav, a rabbi, you'd figure should put in a couple more years in the yeshiva side before. This is what he knew. It was in his mind. This was what he wanted to do, and he went to the least anti-Semitic university around, which was in Bonn. They all had a certain amount of anti-Semitism, but this was relatively less. Where his teacher, his Rebbe, had gone to university, and he never finished. He never got the doctorate for a certain reason, and that is in the middle of his graduate school experience, somebody put a sign up on the bulletin board that wanted, for one of these tiny little German states up here in the north, wanted a chief rabbi for the community. The Germany, as I say, was composed of all kind of little independent duchies and principalities and kingdoms, one of which was, I think, the Grand Duchy of Mecklenburg, and the Grand Duke over there was an autocrat and a dictator, and he had so many Jews in his little Medina, probably 1,000 or 2,000 in all, but it's a separate country, therefore they have a separate chief rabbi for the whole country, Oberrabbiner, and it's a government job. You got your benefits. Okay? I see heads rise. And you take them as is. That is to say, they're not looking to say, where'd you get your smicha? He didn't even need a degree. Can he speak German? Is he a modern? Is he quote unquote normal? Then you got the job. And Hirsch's teachers even told him, apply for it because a reform guy will get it otherwise. And you at least will be better than some reform person, even if you're not fully trained yet, all the rest of it. And he applied and he got it. As I said before, they sent an FBI report on him to find out who his family is, if he's a subversive, come from radical background, none of which showed up on the report. It wasn't true. And he was appointed there for the age, I think, 21, to a job that usually goes to someone, one would imagine, much older, with a great deal more experience. And he never finished his PhD because what he needed for. He got the job. And he ran with the ball for the rest of his life. Now, what's just interesting that is often pointed out is that when he was in graduate school, in his dorm room, his roommate was someone from a very different background, from a much more traditionalistic family, from a much more, to use the current word, much more yeshivish family, who was given a very different type of education and gave a 3-hour pshetel by heart in a Kabbalistic sense at his bar mitzvah and all that, and Abram Geiger, and who came from a very distinguished rabbinic family in Frankfurt, and he was going the other direction. So both of these people were roommates, that one who more or less founds Orthodox Judaism and the one who more or less founds Reform Judaism in Germany. And they kind of knew at the time that they were roommates that they had different tendencies, but at that point they respected each other. Okay? As we'll see, the story kind of changes as time goes on. But it's very significant. I'm not simply trying to share gossip. I'm trying to make a point, and that is they respect each other because there was a very important point upon which they agreed. And that is, something is rotten in the state of Denmark. Something is rotten in the state of Judaism. There are very significant problems with contemporary Yiddishkeit. Traditionalism is deeply flawed. Now, just because two people agree on the diagnosis, doesn't necessarily mean that they agree on the remedy and the cure. But it's significant that people with two radically different hashkafas should agree that things cannot go on as they are. And Judaism, as it currently is constituted, is bankrupt, and will completely alienate the younger generation. It may work for the old timers. It may even possibly work for those who are of a certain age, but those under that age, it's not going to work. So that's very interesting, because when St. Hirsch becomes the rabbi, he didn't have smicha yet. He became the rabbi in this community, in this little Medina, which is I think over there. He didn't have much to do because it wasn't a large Jewish community, and they weren't particularly religious at all. And the only reason he was hired is because there has to be, in a German state, there has to be a chief rabbi, there has to be a chief everything. And just like the Catholics have to have a bishop, and the Protestants have to have a consistory with a Oberkirche, as they call it, the hierarchy, the Jews have to have one also. Even though you and I know this is foreign to the nature of true Judaism, but this is the way the German government saw it. And he had a lot of time on his hands, and he wasn't lazy. And this is really when it's very interesting. Here's a person who's alone and friendless, and writes about it to the friends who are still in school or elsewhere. And he's saying, I have to do what my father said, which is Knei L'cha Chaver. And Knei is the pen, the feather. And, this has to be, that is to say like this: my books are my friends, and my writing is my friends, and I have to find from within the resources to grow. And even though I don't have a chavrusa, you can finish Shas without a chavrusa if you're built that way. It's not easy for everyone. Yeah, you can learn up a storm if you're self-driven. And he clearly was. And so he became remarkably, well-versed, let's put it this way. Became a real Talmud Chacham. What is that? He didn't go to Volozhin, he didn't go to Pressburg, he didn't go to hardly any yeshiva. But he did it. It's a very interesting story. And he didn't have the advantage of, the old traditionalist background in which it's rammed into your head from the age of 3 to memorize everything, and if you're the type that it works for, then you will take off. He did it as a mature person after graduate school. Not too many people are like that. And while he was doing this, he looked around him and he realized a lot of his friends from high school, a lot of his cousins and their friends and people he interacted with were leaving Yiddishkeit. We're just not interested in it. Judaism, as currently constituted, they consider it irrelevant and negative. And the point I'm trying to make at is, flesh of his flesh and blood of his blood. He was from that group. He knew he's the oddball. He's the one that thinks differently. But he understood perfectly the sentiments of those all around him who are leaving, which makes him very different than many other rabbis, even great ones. Because coming from such a radically different background, they found it difficult to connect with the younger generation, just as people, for example, my generation, was not always the easiest thing to connect with a lot of our old Rebbeim who barely spoke English and came from a radically different worldview. We did, but it was always flawed. It's not the same thing as someone who is, shall we say, born in Baltimore and comes out of here and understands the way other people are thinking and what works and what doesn't work for them. And you cannot understand how he becomes the famous Rabbi Samson Rabbi Hirsch without understanding that he was Etzamei Atzamei Bosim Ebisari. That he was someone whose siblings and relatives and friends felt very differently and had no hesitation in sharing with them, and he was listening to what they're saying. And so, at a young age, when he's before 30, he's moved by what he sees, the collapse of Judaism all around it, to write his famous first book, The 19 Letters of an Azil, in which he tried to make the case in German. His father said, write it in Yiddish. He says, I'm not writing Yiddish. Yiddish is not the people I'm writing for. I'm writing for people who cannot speak Yiddish. I'm interested in hitting the crowd that does not want to speak Yiddish, but wants to speak German and interact with modern European culture. And what he said, and the book, of course, I'm sure many have seen it, is in the form of a dialogue between two people, the young person and the older person, and the young person says, Judaism stinks, it's boring, it's lifeless, and all the rest of it. He puts into the mouth of that young person what he hears from all the people around him. I say his own brother, people around him. But then there's the other one, Naphtali, who tries to give the counter-arguments. And one of the most interesting parts, and I don't have time, obviously, in a lecture of this nature to go into, but I want to very strongly urge those who are interested in this subject to get a hold of 19 Letters of Ben Azil, which was translated in 1899 and has been subsequently translated a number of times. Unfortunately, it gets censored every time because it's retranslated. Canons of political correctness, changed. And as far as I know, this is this is the old one, which I got from the Baltimore Library, downtown. This is the 1899 edition. Is the most accurate translation from, unless you can read German, of the original. And in the 18th of the 19th letters, this young rabbi launches a whole passionate attack on the flaws of traditionalism. And it's quite fascinating. And he goes into a long historical disquisition. What went wrong with Judaism? He says it's been going wrong for 2,000 years and more. Mm-hmm. And what he really says is people have never undertaken, with rarest of exceptions, to understand Judaism from the inside, what it really is. Instead, we do a lot of things by rote. We follow the mitzvah. You're told to believe certain things, you believe it without thinking what that means. You're told to do certain things, you do it without thinking what that means. And this happens generation after generation. And after a while, people think that Judaism means following rules without asking what they mean, and believing things without asking what they mean. Thinking too deeply in them is deprecated, is looked down upon. And naturally, he says in older times it might have worked, now it's a turnoff. And he blames this on historical developments. And very interestingly, he says, what are you going to tell me? That there were famous intellectuals that Judaism produced that certainly you can't say were insular, that they knew about the outside world, like the Rambam. He attacks the Rambam hip and thigh. He said, this great man, to whom and to whom alone we owe the preservation of practical Judaism in our time, because the Rambam was the Rambam, he wrote the Mishnah Torah. And I might say this Shabbos is the Rambam's yahrzeit. This great man is responsible because he sought to reconcile Judaism with the difficulties which confronted it from without, instead of developing it creatively from within. He is responsible for all the good and for all the evil which bless and afflict the heritage of the Father. He entered into Judaism from without, bringing with him opinions of whose truth he had convinced himself from extraneous sources, and then he undertook to reconcile. Meaning, even those attempts to try to intellectualize, to bring the correct hashkafas, and to go beyond the rote, were wrong, were flawed. And it's quite remarkable. And the reason they're flawed is because they're coming from an externalist point of view. They say, what does modern society, whether in the 1100s or in the year 2007, what does modern society tell us is the right way for people to act? What does modern society tell us is the right relationship, for example, between the sexes? What does modern society tell us is the right political structure? Now, let's compare what that is and see if the Torah lives up to it. He's saying that's wrong. That's not the way you're supposed to do it. You're supposed to do it the other way around. Let's find out what the Torah says, and now see whether the standards of modern society match it. It's a different way of looking at things. And he goes on to this at very great length. As I said, I don't have the time to read it for there. And as he says here, only a very few during this entire period stood with their intellectual efforts entirely within Judaism. There's only a few people made an intellectual effort to understand Judaism beyond the level of just practice and do and learn more Gemara and keep more mitzvahs and then you die, And only very few built it up out of its own inner concepts. Most distinguished among these are the author of the Kuzari and the son of Nachman. So he says, if you want to get real Judaism, don't go for the Rambam, you go for the Ramban and the Kuzari, which I told you before is what his Rebbe was into, and it's a different way of doing it. This condition of uncomprehended Judaism became particularly prevalent in Germany. So he says, forget the Sephardim now, and let's go to the Ashkenazim, because he's an Ashkenazi Jew living in Germany in the 19th century. Our Judaism has been for a long time, centuries, radically flawed. Okay? Radically flawed. Where ages of persecution and oppression have suppressed every free or upward movement of the mind. Now he says like this, as far as emotion and sentiment is concerned, then I'm not talking. We Ashkenazi Jews have been heroes. And you have many great tzaddikim and tzidkonios that have been produced by Ashkenazic civilization in terms of conduct and what we call the Judaism of the heart. He said, I'm not denying that. The general fundamental principle of God, the All One, and the Torah as His will, and the fulfillment of the Torah in terms of Avas Hashem and Yiras Hashem, retained everywhere its living force. And life, with all its possessions and all its pleasures, was offered in magnificent devotion as a willing sacrifice to it. I'm not denying, he says, the Ashkenazi Jews have, like we know in the Crusades and afterwards, never hesitated to make the supreme sacrifice, and certainly sacrifice in terms of economics, for the purpose of Yiddishkeit. So that they got right. But if you ask them, why do you keep mitzvahs? What do you understand when you put on tzitzis? What do you understand when you keep Shabbos? What do you understand when you daven? You end up with what he calls uncomprehended Judaism. And therefore, again, skipping around, considering all these influences together, you will be able to comprehend the appearance which Judaism presented 80 years ago, meaning just before the modern era hit, where he sees Ashkenazic Judaism in Germany and places like that in a state of decline. Not that people are not Shomer Shabbos, and not that people are keeping mitzvahs, and not they don't believe. So most people say, well then fine, everything's okay. And he said, why are you so minimalist? Why are you so superficial in what you regard as Judaism? That's not what Judaism is. It's not a system of practices. It's not simply a set of beliefs. Judaism is transformative. When you daven and you say Kriya Shema, you should emerge out of that a different person. When you perform a mitzvah, it should be something you remember for years and years afterwards. That's what the Torah is about. It's supposed to be a life-changing kind of experience and an entire separate culture which the practitioners recognize as, in their own lives, it's far beyond anything else that's out there. Is that true? Well, this is what he asks. And so the point I'm trying to make by these quotes is that he was a nonconformist in many regards. But you can't say he's not religious. But wait a minute, it's very untraditional to criticize the status quo. It still is. That's one of the things that people who are religious are not supposed to do. But he does. And of course, he wasn't part of the system, and that's probably why he did it. But nevertheless, look what he does. And he ends up, almost a peroration, he says, what is the present state? Well, the first delights of the worldly spirit have passed away, meaning freedom or French Revolution and so forth. Other generations have succeeded to those who witnessed the first change in Jewish sentiment, and today, two diametrically opposite parties confront each other within Judaism. The one party has inherited uncomprehended Judaism as a mechanical habit. Mitzvahs anoshim lumodo. As I said, rote. They do it, they believe it, whatever they're told to believe, and that's it. Without its spirit, they bear in their hands as a sacred relic, a revered mummy, and they fear to rouse its spirit. The other party are partly filled with noble enthusiasm for the welfare of the Jews. Some of my best friends are Reformed Jews, which was not far from the truth. But these people look upon Judaism as a lifeless framework, as something which should be laid in the grave of a long since dead and buried past. They seek its spirit and find it not or in danger with all their efforts to help the Jews of severing the last life nerve of Judaism ignorantly. And so he says neither side is right. And, obviously there's one way to salvation, and that's to know Judaism out of itself, to learn its utterances, from its own utterances, its science of life. I take the trouble tonight to go into detail about this because you can't simply say, Sam's Rabbi Hirsch, it's Torah Derech Eretz, it's modern, you go to yeshiva, you also go to college, you get a profession, and gamarnu. That's not who he was. That may be what it kind of eventually evolves into. That's not who he was. And he undertook, by the way, I might say that Abraham Geiger gave us a glowing book review, although wasn't followed up with what he thought it would be followed up with. But many Jews in Germany, young people, wrote to Hirsch and says, you saved my life in the spiritual sense. I was wandering around in my mind, profoundly troubled by the fact that what I learned at home was so vastly different from what I was taught in school and in college. And I didn't know how to put it together. The crisis of the modern Jew who goes to college, as they say, and what shall we say, takes history and philosophy courses and Bible courses. It's not a pretty picture. In other words, it's painful. And he was perfectly aware of this. Now, Hirsch went on to publish 2 years later his exposition of the way he sees that you should look for meaning within Judaism, and that's his famous Chorev. And he followed up with other writings in his life. And the point he tries to make everywhere is that one has to look for the symbolic meaning behind the mitzvah and try to invest it with as much meaning as one can summon by taking the trouble to master the meanings of the various mitzvahs. As I say before, Shabbos is not just Shabbos. Shabbos should be a theologically transforming kind of event. Every time Friday night comes, you should be thinking certain things, and you should be experiencing certain things. And he develops at a great length. And that's true for tzitzis and tefillin and mezuzah and mikveh and 100 other areas. And it's not true that all modern Jews and Jews in Germany went and read his books and started thinking his way about all the various mitzvahs. I'm just telling you the way he did it. I might add as an aside that he was particularly bothered by what he regards as the superficial approach of the Rambam and others to what they call the Tamei HaMitzvos, the reasons behind the mitzvahs. This is a classic problem that's been in Judaism at least since the time of Shlomo HaMelech, if we follow the Chazal, and that is, what's the reason you do the mitzvahs? Should it be that you just keep Shabbos and shut up and don't ask any questions? Or is Shabbos there for a purpose? But if Shabbos is there to teach you something, then it's only a means to an end. And if it's a means to an end, why do I have to bother with the means if I can get to the end anyway? I mean, if Shabbos, and he says these words, I just don't want to read endlessly from the book. If Shabbos is simply remember, did God rested or Vayachulu, I'll read it, I remember it, I'll put it on a billboard. I don't have to keep a Bishul and Borer and all these other crazy 1,001 details, as he puts it, of Shabbos that we're so familiar with. If a mezuzah is about remembering that God protects the house, so I don't have to have mezuzah of this size and of this parchment and all the rest of it. Give me a break. And this goes back to Shlomo HaMelech, the Chazal tell us, who also said, he says, why does the Torah say a king can't have too many wives and too much gold and silver? So he shouldn't become arrogant. I won't become arrogant. I hear the point. I get it. I hear the point. It didn't work, but I hear the point. This is the famous statement that they make about Shlomo. So wait a minute. So you're telling me that if you do a mitzvah without thinking about it, that's not good. But then you're telling me if you do a mitzvah with thinking about it, it's not good. So what are you supposed to do? Huh? And what Samson Rabbi Hirsch would say is, if you go at these superficial explanations, then the incorrect explanations, they'll lead the road to perdition. But on the other hand, if you find genuine explanations, interpretations, then they won't. And his famous attack, as I say before in the Rambam, is composed of I'll give just one example. Why does it say, thou shalt not kill? So he said, well, the Rambam, everybody knows that. I mean, how can you have a society in which people are allowed to kill? It becomes impossible to live. So it's what you call mitzvah sichlios. Even your own seichel could figure that one out. There's not a country out there, I don't think, that at the level of law allows murder. But wait a minute, Hirsch says. You, the Rambam, know better than anyone else that if you're a real Talmid Chacham, and you know all the Talmudic laws, and the Doraisas and the Rabbanans, it's perfectly possible to kill somebody and get away with it. Midoraisa, anyway. Various types of broma, indirect action, all the rest of it. I don't want to give them any ideas over here. So I won't go into details, but but this is, you can say, ask your local rabbi, But it's true. Same thing for theft and damages. And if you know the intricacies of the law, just like anyone knows the intricacies of any law, you can actually get away with quite a bit. Then explain it. Either say, I don't know why, or if you want to undertake to explain it, then say, I'm going to explain lo tirzach in such a way that the explanation takes into account all the exceptions. Shabbos. What do you do in Shabbos when you're not allowed to work? You know that's not true. There's plenty of work you can do in Shabbos. You can't do the 39 malachas and so forth at the level of midoraisa. But there are many other types of hard labor. Why? It doesn't make any sense. If it's a day of rest, you should be prohibited any kind of hard work, which the Rabbanan eventually kind of do. But why did God make a law which perfectly allows you to do many kinds of strenuous physical activity and labor, and you can even go shopping, if you made a raisa, and then yet call it a day of rest? If you're going to undertake to give me an explanation of what Shabbos is, make sure your explanation takes into account, as a scientist would do, all the variables, all the little rules. And he undertook to do this in Charav and other kinds of work. So this is just a pet sort of thing that he did. Now, in a few years later, he moved to a larger country, and a few years a larger country, to finally in 1840, he was appointed the chief rabbi of a significant Medina. There's a Moravia over here, which right next, right where I'm pointing, which was a state within the Austrian Empire. Moravia is already bordering on Hungary. Marin, this is an old Jewish tradition from thousands of years. This was not a place in which you simply had, as he had mostly in Germany, Balabatim, who were Amaratzim. Even those who were more observant, but they didn't know anything. Moravia is a place that has a long, shall we say, yeshiva tradition. I spoke about the Chassam Sofer, who was in Pressburg, but a very famous colleague of the Chassam Sofer, Mordechai Bennett, is the name some have heard of, was in Nikolsburg, the capital of Moravia. And for centuries, literally centuries, this was a leading center of Torah scholarship and Judaism, and highly developed Jewish autonomy. They had the Shai Takonos, the 310 statutes that all the communities within the state were subject to, very highly regulated. I'll give you an example. All the yeshivas in Moravia had to learn the same Gemara every year. I mean, everybody had to be literally on the same page. It's the job of the chief rabbi under Austrian law to check to make sure all the yeshivas are using the same Masechta. Highly regulated state. But it's 1840, and it was going through a period in which the traditionalism was dissolving. And so you had this situation, which we do not have today, but you had in Baltimore, let's say 70 years ago, in which there was such a radical difference between the older types and the younger types. They lived in they lived in the same house, but they occupied two different worlds. This group speaks Yiddish, this group spoke English. This group was interested in keeping Shabbos, all the rest of it. Their own children were not. We're not unfamiliar with that experience. That's what Moravia was happening in Moravia in 1840, and he was appointed the chief rabbi there for 11 years. Here he suffered, very interestingly, from both sides. He was too left for the right and too right for the left. He, he knew the younger generation, for example, is more interested. The younger generation is not going to stand difficult Gemaras and give a populistic exposition. The people aren't interested in and can't even comprehend it. But you can talk about the Parsha. We can talk about the Tehillim. We had a class today of that type in the explanation of what you're saying in the Davening Tehillim. Well, the older people said, what kind of a rabbi is it? They can't learn, and he does that's the kiss of death. He doesn't know how to learn, and he's a second-rater, and where do we get this guy from, and all the rest of it. The young people said, he's too religious. He looks normal, but he talks too religious. The older people considered absolutely shocking that he was seen on Shabbos, in public, walking in the street with a woman. That was his wife. But this was not done. I'm trying to know. There are norms of the old society from which we are very far removed. A Rav in public? Now, what is this? And as I say before, he got ground from both sides in the middle. So he tried to make a yeshiva, but tried to make it modern, something along the lines of a modern seminary. Well, as I said before, it was too yeshivish for the modern and too modern for the yeshivish. And he had a very difficult time in this decade that he was the rabbi there, which means that it became crystal clear to him that what you need in life, as we all know, is the right shidduch and not the wrong one. It has to be the right place at the right time with the right group. And this is as true of a rabbi in a community as a husband and a wife. You can have somebody who will be very good spouse at this time and this place for someone else, but not over here, and vice versa. Consequently, he was very relieved when, in 1851, after he'd been, as I say, 11 years as rabbi in Moravia, but was really dissatisfied with life, that he got his famous offer from Frankfurt, which was a city, to come to a breakaway synagogue which had taken advantage of the recent revolution in Germany to get permission to form a private minyan, a Religionsgesellschaft, a religious corporation, not a official synagogue, but which wanted to be Orthodox. At least that's what they thought. They didn't know what they wanted in their own mind. But a group broke away from the Kehillah and wanted to do something much more traditional than the Kehillah wanted. Now, even though this was a breakaway shul and the salary wasn't the same and all the rest of it, he jumped at it and he said yes. Because he realized, as I said before, it has to be the right. For a successful rabbi, it has to be the right congregation, right time, and right place, and it's over there and it's not here. And so he gave up a more elevated position, at the official level, government benefits and everything that goes along with being a civil servant in Central Europe, for a non-government job, which was shaky, and a shul that they didn't know where it's going to go. But he was willing to do it because he saw, this is the place for me and my culture and the type of message that I can put across. With this group, it won't be too far to the right, it won't be too far to the left, it'll be like Goldilocks, just right. And he went there and he never turned back. So he was, I guess, 51 minus 6. He was in his early 40s when he took this job. He wasn't a young man. It was a job, and he stayed there for the rest of his life. Now, here is the background, which is absolutely necessary to know for what he does with the rest of his life. And that is Frankfurt, as you see, is a separate city, as I said before. It was a separate country forever. It used to be the ceremonial capital of the Holy Roman Empire, but that meant nothing. So basically, it ruled itself, had a senate, what we call today a city council. And Frankfurt, which I described earlier, I think, in class, the old ghetto and everything, the horrible conditions in which Jews lived before the French Revolution, is an Ir Ve'ein B'Yisrael. It's a Jewish community that always was a major center of Yiddishkeit for many, many, many centuries. Even when the Jews were expelled from 97% of Germany back in the late 1400s, early 1500s, the Jews of Frankfurt remained. And the list of rabbis and intellectuals and so forth is like endless. So this is an old community. But that didn't mean anything by the time you get to the early 1800s. The winds of change were moving, and as I said before, the old traditionalists completely lost, or I shouldn't say completely, but lost significant portions of the young who grew up alienated from traditionalism, except that in Frankfurt they became much more radical. And to put it in simple terms, they agitated in the Kehillah elections. They eventually won a majority of the board, and when they did, they played hardball.
Wait 1 minute.
When it came to the case of Frankfurt, when the reform sector of the community gained the power, these were not particularly rich people, by the way. These were up-and-coming CPAs, lawyers, young businessmen, the type. And they wanted their place in the sun. But the fact of the matter is, as I say before, they played hardball. What do I mean when they play hardball? As soon as they got control of the Kehillah, they cut the funding from every religious institution. They defunded the mikvah. You don't need that. They defunded what we would call the cheters and the schools of this nature. They actually went so far as to use their police powers, because remember, even though you're talking about the 1800s, in Germany the old laws were still in the books, in which the Jewish community can't exactly force you to do things, but they can take administrative measures that can discriminate against you and hurt you in various ways. And if they're buddy with the local police, as used to be the case in America and possibly still is, if you want to get somebody out of town, you want to get somebody in trouble, it can happen. And the result is that they made what amounts to as an attack on the religious members of the community, who were very turned off by this, but there was nothing you could do. And all you had was a festering anger for a number of years, between 1844, I think, and 1848. And in 1848, almost all of Europe erupted in revolutions. There was a huge number of revolutions throughout Germany and in France and in Italy and throughout the Austro-Hungarian Empire and elsewhere. And the result is that there was a wave of liberalism. And even though the revolutions were suppressed, but the liberalism made its impact. And ironically, the Orthodox Jews, you might say, they used this opportunity to say, freedom of religion. Why should we be bossed around by these other Jews who don't feel as we do? Everybody should have the right to practice their own way. They shouldn't have the right to make laws against us. Now, if the tables would have been turned, they wouldn't have said that. But being that the situation was that they were a helpless minority, they appealed to liberal and democratic principles in order to gain their own freedom, and they got it. At least to the degree that the government of the city said you can make a private minyan, private shul. You still have to pay full taxes to the Kehillah, even though it's reformed, and you still have to be full members subject to the general rules, but we're not going to force you to go on Saturday to a place that you don't feel comfortable. If you want to go Friday night, Saturday service and so forth, some other kind of framework, as long as you don't make trouble for the rest of the community, you can do it. And that was enough for them, or at least that's all they could get. And within a shul, it started with 10, 11 people, but the key point is one of those first 10, 15 people, and it's quality or is it quantity? One of the first 15 people who joined the group was Baron Rothschild. It doesn't hurt to have Harry Weinberg in your steeple. It doesn't hurt. And indeed, Rothschild said, and the dander was up, and they said, we'll pay the taxes, and we'll do this, and I'll see you in raising. We'll build our own shul anyway. And this idea of we will fight against you, and if you force us to do things, we'll do it, and we'll show you that in spite of all that, in your face, we will create our institutions, what it takes, animated this group, which grew to 100 members, over 100 members. But which way do they want to go? What's really interesting is that they're searching around for the right person to be the rabbi. The Reform Jews in the community said, if you get yourself a Yiddish-speaking, fur hat, Strangler Payas type rabbi from Poland, we'll pay his salary. I wonder why. And these Jews said, we're not looking for that. He said, well, you want Orthodox, that's Orthodox. That's traditional, which it was. But you see, they want somebody who will only appeal to the desiccated, decaying minority of middle-aged and older types. They, God forbid, do not want someone who will possibly have any kind of appeal to the younger element. And these people were determined to do just that. The funny thing is, they elected, actually, this group elected a conservative rabbi as their first rabbi. His name was Michael Sachs, and he was the rabbi of the Kehillah in Berlin, and he wasn't Orthodox, he was conservative. He was a fantastic speaker, and he wrote some almost best-selling books on the Sephardic poetry in the 1840s. Notice he was a name that had great prestige, and he was a Shomer Shabbos. Well, he was what you would say today, halachically observant. I didn't check his tzitzis or anything, but he wasn't Orthodox. And that was okay, because they weren't checking his tzitzis either. He eventually came to Frankfurt and changed his mind. I think the community made him a better offer where he was, and they returned. And history turns on that hinge. And then they said, what do we do now? And eventually somebody said, well, what do you bet this guy Hirsch, who's he's too modern for these crazy East European barbarians in Moravia, and he might be just right for us. And they offered him a job, and he took it. Decrease in salaries, I say, and all the rest of it, but he took it. And as I say, when he came there in 1851, he said, we're going to build something out of this big. And we're going to make this not just a private minyan, we're going to turn it l'shem luciferis. Because, as he mentioned over here, Judaism is not just about going to Shachris, Mincha, and Ma'ariv. It's not just about practicing the laws. There's a lot more to it. And as you can get a little bit of a feel from the few lines that I read you, it was very eloquent. As we've seen, he had a first-class secular education. a classical humanist education. I tell you, I can't. It's not like colleges today where they go easier and they curb the grades and all the rest of it. In his time when he went there, it was sink or swim. So if you swam, you were good. And he wants to use all of his talents and all of his God-given energies in the service of his holy cause. That's what he sees. And he said that in his second speech. And he rallies the troops. And not only does he rally the troops, but he inspires them with a great spirit. And it's also true that right at that time, a process of urbanization is occurring that I described earlier in Frankfurt, in which the Jewish population goes from something like 6,000 to 26,000 within the next 30 or so years. Think what I just said. And the great majority of the people who are moving in to Frankfurt are moving in from the surrounding countryside, the farmers and people who were never allowed in early decades and centuries to live in the city because of the old anti-Semitic laws. And now, little by little, those are fading away, and Jews are moving in there. Who are the people that are moving to the city? Dorfjuden, people from small towns. They're very traditional. They are not intellectuals and all the rest of it, but these are the people he can recruit. These are the people who, if they're offered a synagogue as fancy as the Reform or better, a sermon as fancy as the Reform or better, an aesthetic as fancy as theirs or better, they'll join the Orthodox one, and they did. And here's the most significant part of the program, I argue tonight. As soon as he came there, he said, a shul is great, but nowadays, a shul is distinctly secondary. Everybody needs a place to daven, no question about it. And eventually they built themselves a very elegant and fancy one. But it's distinctly secondary importance. Schools, chinuch, that's it. He knew it because he himself had gone through that, as I described it before. And he said, nobody sees this. I see it. But I'm not going to, usually when a person says, I see something, and everyone else doesn't see it, they say, you're crazy. He said, but I'm not. Look, if I am, show me. We need what you and I today call day schools. And this was his big chiddush. Now, he himself had gone to a prototype of a day school, which was, nothing special, but on the other hand, I don't want to knock it either. He said we have to take this idea and empower it, invigorate it, valorize it. He himself became a great student of, the Montessori, in his case, the Pestalozzi models, meaning he put a lot of time and effort into reading up on all the non-Jewish educational experts in order to understand how best to do elementary education and junior high education, because we need to do this to catch the modern boy and girl. Use that, of course, for his goals. Use that to bring Judaism to them, using the modernity and the idiom of the 19th century. And he said, our resources before you build a shul, I want to see the school. And if we have money, if we have $100 to spend, and it's a question whether the shul will go without lighting or the school, the money go to the school. Because that's the future. It's like investing in a business. If you don't invest in the business, forget it. Sure, they can live off the dividends, but you know what's going to happen. You have to constantly plow, pour the money into the schools. And everything else will take care of itself. And he was absolutely visionary in this. And people looked at him as strange, because this is not what a Rav does. This is not the model of a chief rabbi of a Kehillah. The model of chief rabbi of Kehillah is to paskin shalos. If you want to give a couple speeches, that's a little unusual, but that's okay too. You want to have, if you want to have work in chinuch, that's understandable too. Make a yeshiva. Gather to yourself 10, 20 boys like in Hungary, 30, 40 even, and train them in intense Gemara and all that. That's good too. A rabbi, a Rav, doesn't study how to make a better first grade. A Rav is not wasting his time on kindergarten. He's certainly not talking about, what kind of textbooks you do in the 6th grade. He definitely is not going to spend time on the education of girls. This is well beneath the purview of someone who's the rabbi of a community. Now you can hire a teacher, you can hire a principal and all that stuff. This is not the job of a Rav. He says you're all wrong. Spending time on the curriculum of the 6th grade is more important than all the other things put together. Spending time, listen to this, on figuring out what to do in terms of activities on Sunday afternoon. What we say today, evening, that's more important than any other part of the job. Boy, was he ahead of the time. And they said, but how can you do this sort of? And if it means that we'll have a glee club, or whatever was popular in the 19th century, we'll have a jam session with violins. We'll take the school. Well, that's right. You take the school out on skiing, when in the wintertime on the lakes. If you lead the students out on hikes, things that you and I are somewhat familiar with nowadays. They were considered absolutely radical and crazy for someone in his position, and he says, I'm right and you're wrong. And you all better wake up and smell the coffee. And if you don't, you will pay the price. And therefore, from the very first time he came there, he put his attention into, as I said, education, but he noticed something very interesting in studying the education, and that is elementary school is fine, high school where it counts, the teenage years. Even today, if someone goes and has a completely non-Jewish education at the elementary level, but they go to a Jewish high school, whatever it is, any solid Jewish high school, they will emerge Jewish. If someone has the most intensive elementary Jewish education, and they will go to a non-Jewish high school, it's a bracha l'vatol, 99% of the time. There's exceptions, but the great majority of the time, it's wasted. He was thinking in these terms in 1851. Why was he thinking in these terms in 1850? He had many years to think about things. Other people, when they have time on their hands, waste it. To him, wasting was unknown. Where should Judaism go? Should we just bemoan the direction of the young Jew? Or should we do something? If we do something, what are we going to do? Tell everybody they should all go to yeshiva. It's not going to happen in the 19th century Germany. The perfect is the enemy of the good. It's not going to happen. To say that we should continue the old system of not educating girls at the formal level in Torah, it's not going to happen. It doesn't work. And to me, one of the most interesting things about saying to Rabbi Hirsch is he never asked any shilos in his entire career. Many other rabbis disapproved of what he did. Many others looked askance at what he did, particularly in Hungary and in Russia and such places like this. He never even paid any attention to them because he always took the position, which they came to respect, which is, you know your area, I know my area. Notice, I know Germany. You don't understand the reality over here. And they said, okay, if you say so, Basically what they said is, we'll judge the product by the results. If the people come out at the end of their Shomer Shabbos and the rules, all the rest of it, maybe it's something we would do, probably something we wouldn't do, but we can't argue with success. It was very interesting. And the first school he opened is the high school. Right? First for the boys, then for the girls. And only afterwards he opened the elementary school. He did not create a high school of 12 grades, but one with 10 grades. He did not create a college prep school. Very interesting. He says, that's not what we need. I'm not interested in creating a few doctors and lawyers and scientists. I'm interested in basic, broad education necessary, as I said before, a business career. And I want people, men and women, boys and girls, to emerge out of school feeling good about Judaism, wanting to continue to be religious Jews, electing on their own to remain members of the community, building up a very strong community as much as possible in terms of institutions, which will be able to take them in and integrate them, and then use those people to do the same. So he's looking for a broad base of Balei Batim to provide a middle-class, bourgeois, totally religious, although not necessarily very Talmudically learned, population. And by and large, he kind of succeeded. His original group of 120, by the time he died, was something like 400. And eventually, I think, before Hitler's time, reached something like 750 or 800 families. So it's not the most gigantic community in the world, but on the other hand, it's quite large. And as I say before, even though he used to talk about the rhetoric of not having enough light for the school and the shul, Rothschild used to cover the expenses. And eventually many members of his community prospered in business. It's quite interesting. Many people of that shul were wealthier than the Reform. It's not the way people imagine it. In fact, by the time you get to the late 19th century, there's no question that it's interesting, the real money was in the Hirsch congregation. I mean, bankers, well-to-do stockbrokers, people that had very successful businesses. The Reform community was mainly composed, as I say before, of attorneys, of people who have jobs with the government. They had their share of well-to-do people also, don't get me wrong. But nevertheless, it's not what you imagine. And I once read Professor Breuer, who obviously a great-great-grandson of Rabbi Hirsch, and he says his father told him when they used to have their annual board meetings or, membership meetings, and there's a shortfall. There's always a shortfall in every show. People with different balabatim would get up and they say, I want the right, privilege to make up the do we have somebody like that? All of which means that he was talking about creating a certain model, and that is a model of education which is very different than the old traditionalist yeshivas. First of all, in its comprehensiveness, because it includes women as well as men, but second of all, in its goals. And this has been controversial from day one, and remains controversial till today. Because and I'll try to argue if we get there in a future class that this conflictedness is part of the differences we have among each other as to the proper direction of chinuch and education and so forth nowadays. You have to understand the historical roots of it, and it becomes, I argue, much clearer. So I haven't done this subject complete justice. I will try to do that in the next lecture.
Well done.
Here are some notes.
Pick up the microphone before people start. Harold?
What's going on with the rest of the schedule? Take one question.
All right, I'll take one question from the writing and then a written question, and I'll use live people. Let's see. It says, how did Rabbi Hirsch's attitudes towards non-Jews compare with that of traditional Torah Judaism? Were there any particular early rabbinic authorities whom he relied on in shaping his hashkafa in this area? The answer, of course, is yes. He is. Hirsch is much more modern and therefore much more liberal in his writings about people who are not Jewish than one finds in traditional Judaism. This is, of course, not surprising because not only it's not a question of the fact that he went to college. It's a question of what I tried to describe before. Does Judaism really teach us to not like people who are not Jewish? In traditional life, and surrounded by ghettos and anti-Semitism, it emerged that way. That's not what the Torah teaches. That's his argument. That's not what the Torah. That's part of uncomprehended Judaism. If you understand what the mitzvahs and the whole message of the Torah is about, we really, think about it. We want to help the whole world. We're not out to dominate anybody. Our notion of a perfect world is not in which, all the Gentiles are our slaves or something like that. On the contrary, what do we say every day in Al Kain Nekami? You say it all the time in Alenu. We want to get rid of the idols. We want to help them to shed their false beliefs and then move to a higher state of enlightenment. So no one should dislike someone, unless perhaps I'm Moloch. No one should dislike someone just because they're not Jewish. So Hirsch's attitude in this matter is, in his mind, coming from what he sees as the inner core teachings of the Torah, which too often have been obscured for perfectly understandable historical reasons by the anti-Semitism and the circle the wagons mentality that was necessary for the Jews to maintain over many, many centuries. Are there any other questions? Okay. Here we have a PhD in history from the University of Chicago. Just want to know.
A ringer.
Had the Hassan Sofer been in Frankfurt and had Rabbi Hirsch been in Hungary, would the alternative models have possibly succeeded? In other words, would the hot
I
house...
will try to deal with that next week when we get to the other extremely important figure, of course, in German Jewish Orthodoxy, which is Rav Hildesheimer, who was a rabbi in Hungary and had all kinds of adventures there as a result of the fact that he embraced one version of what we're talking about today. Of course, that's a very good question, obviously, and it really is. I'll try my best to address that next time. Mir Hashem.
How would Rabbi Hirsch have felt about the concept of Torah matter as represented today by Yeshiva University?
Obviously, this is debated forever. So if you're asking me questions, how would he have? Yeah, that's not history already. That's, if my grandmother had wheels. Oh, great. No more questions? Good night.
He did not want to recognize Reform Judaism, where other Orthodox rabbis did recognize Reform Judaism as being part of it.
I'll try to, that's not exactly the way it was, but I know what you mean. I'll try to deal with that next week. I really.
All right.